Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Ball. I'm Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and a professor of psychology here at the University of Maryland, College Park. It is my pleasure to welcome our panelists and the audience to this timely Sadat Forum on 9/11 and its aftermath, Squandering Global Goodwill. I needn't say how important this subject is to all of us and how painful the journey has been since that tragic day 20 years ago. I can't think of a better group of people to address the question at hand. Before Professor Talhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development, introduces the speakers in more detail, I want to personally welcome Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who is a distinguished American diplomat, having served as an ambassador to both Afghanistan and Iraq. Dean Amaney Jamal of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, who's an expert on Arab public opinion, and senior fellow at Brookings, Bruce Riedel, who has had a distinguished government career, including serving as special assistant to President George W. Bush on the Middle East when the 9/11 attack occurred. Of course, the panel will be moderated by our own Professor Talhami, to whom I now turn to lead the conversation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Dean Ball, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you especially to my esteemed panelists. In all honesty, as the Dean said, I can't think of a better group of people to have the conversation I hope we will have today. So thank you for joining us. I'm obviously not going to do lengthy introductions. This is an amazingly distinguished group that that would take forever to fill in all the details. But I am going to say a few things about each one of them. Let me start with welcoming Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who is, I think, widely regarded as one of America's top diplomats, period. I needn't to go through his entire resume, but just to give you a flavor, he has served as ambassador to 6 countries during very critical times in our nation, including ambassador to Afghanistan, ambassador to Pakistan, ambassador to Iraq, ambassador to Kuwait, ambassador to Syria. So he has had some of the toughest missions during critical times, and therefore he was really he saw things firsthand. He was already recognized as an exceptional diplomat throughout his career and ultimately received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award. After retiring, he also became the dean of the Bush School at Texas A&M and has had affiliations with multiple institutions, including Princeton, and more recently as non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Next is Amaney Jamal. Amaney, to my mind, is a star scholar who's now dean. Really, we're hosting her. I don't know if this is her first public event beyond Princeton since she's become dean, which is just a few days ago. So it's a pleasure to welcome her. She has had a distinguished career prior to becoming the dean of Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs as a scholar who is an award-winning author of multiple books and academic articles, highly recognized nationally and internationally, written about many of the issues that touch on our conversation, and has been a principal of the Arab Barometer, which has measured Arab public opinion over many years. And she is there, obviously, to talk to us about some of those findings and her assessment of our policy over the past 2 years and how it's been perceived in the Middle East, particularly. Last but not least is my friend and colleague at Brookings, Bruce Riedel, who to my mind is one of the finest government analysts I have ever interacted with in all my years of interacting in government. Those who've known Bruce have appreciated the fine analysis and the intellectual honesty that he brings to his analysis while he was in government and since leaving government. He served for many years as a CIA analyst in many Middle Eastern countries, and he happened to be the special assistant to President George W. Bush for the Middle East when the 9/11 attack occurred. Since then, he's also advised President Obama, particularly on Afghanistan and Pakistan, being charged with preparing a white paper for the Obama policy on that issue, and has been a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a director of the Brookings Intelligence Project. He has been prolific, those of you who follow him. He's written many books, and he has a new one coming out on the US-Jordanian relationship. So I am really excited about having this conversation with this distinguished panel. But allow me first to give you a bit of a personal introduction to the issue at hand that perhaps could set the mood and also give us a little bit more of a background on issues that some of us have been part of. 20 years ago to the day, today, I received a phone call in my office at the University of Maryland from William Burns. At the time, Burns was Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. He asked me to pencil in a day in later in September for Secretary of State Colin Powell to deliver an important speech on foreign policy that would set a different tone as our Sadat lecture for peace. And I was very excited, but that speech had a history, and some of us on this panel are familiar with that history a little bit. Needless to say, Secretary Powell, admired as he was and popular as he was throughout the Bush administration, he was not the one who was driving policy on the Middle East most of the time. And he has wanted to give a speech that would set a different tone for months, but the White House was reluctant to have that done. And he had prepared drafts for many months. As we know, the Bush administration at the time was dealing with the Middle East, mostly focused on possibility of confrontation with Iraq, even prior to 9/11. But the issue of the day was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which had, with the advent of the Second Intifada, which was very violent for the previous months. And the Bush administration was certainly taking very clear positions supporting the government of Israel in that confrontation. Something happened later in the spring, early summer, when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Abdullah, sent a letter to the president turning down an invitation to meet with him and criticizing American policy toward the Palestinians. This came as something of a shock to the administration. The relationship with Saudi Arabia was critical for the president at that time. And consequently, I was invited personally with 3 other experts from the outside to come to the White House for a meeting with then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and other officials of the White House for brainstorming about what to do. In fact, my colleague Bruce Riedel was at that meeting at that time. So was William Burns himself from the State Department. And she was very frank. She said, our approach is not working. And she was trying to figure out to get ideas about what to do. In the meanwhile, there is no question that Powell's pitch was taken hold more over the summer. And clearly when Burns called me on September 10, 2001, he had already gotten the authorization to give that speech that he had wanted to give. Obviously, we know what happened the next day. The horror we all experienced that turned things upside down, turned priorities on their heads, and clearly Secretary Powell didn't deliver the Anwar Sadat lecture in September of that year. But Nelson Mandela ended up actually giving that lecture because 9/11 brought Nelson Mandela to Washington, and he met with President Bush, and he gave his support for the war, the early war in Afghanistan. I want to, I think it's very interesting to review the shift in Mandela's position over a very short period of time, which I think speaks volumes about America's squandering of the global goodwill that came our way in the immediate aftermath of that horror. The sympathy that we got, even support from countries like Iran. Now, recall that Mandela was a critic of the West and American foreign policy. He was really kind of an unlikely supporter of President George W. Bush. And yet, speaking at our Sadat lecture in November of that year, after meeting with President Bush, he spoke, by the way, to 10,000 people that turned out for him during that painful month for the University of Maryland, with not only 9/11, but also a tornado that killed 2 of our students on campus. Speaking at Maryland, he said, "We have had the occasion to express ourselves publicly in support of the current military actions by the United States and Britain in pursuit of those they identified as the perpetrators of the acts of terror. We accept that the United States and Britain are bent on bringing to book the identified terrorists, and that the unfortunate civilian casualties that arise are coincidental. We accept that they will and are taking all precautions possible within a war situation to minimize civilian casualties and suffering." This is what he said after meeting with Bush. And even after he went to South Africa, he gets some criticism as the war was expanding. And 2 weeks later, he says, in South Africa, "I support the strikes against Afghanistan as far as it is intended to flush out Osama bin Laden. I have no sympathy with the terrorists who kill 5,000 civilians. I can't tolerate that." And yet, within 2 weeks, when the scope of war became clearer and civilian casualties in Afghanistan were rising, he was beginning to have doubts and change his positions. He said a couple of weeks later, "I never supported the bombing of the whole of Afghanistan and the killing of innocent children, elderly people, women, and the disabled. I confined myself to bin Laden and his organization." And within months later, his regrets went to the very idea that he even gave a green light to the war itself. He was changing his mind even about a limited operation. He said, our view may have been one-sided and overstated. Such unreserved support for the war in Afghanistan gives the impression that we are insensitive to and uncaring about the suffering inflicted upon the Afghan people in the country. Labeling of Osama bin Laden as a terrorist responsible for those acts before he has been tried and convicted could also be seen as undermining some of the basic tenets of the rule of law. But what really turned the attitude of Mandela around completely was the beginning of the talk of an American war on Iraq within months, without the support of the United Nations. And ultimately, he called the US stand as arrogant. He called President Bush as a president who can't think properly and wants to plunge the world into a Holocaust. He had come a full circle. This is all within a few months from, a clear support coming from someone who was not likely to be an ally of President George W. Bush. And I think this perhaps maps out a lot of the transition that occurred in international opinion and views of what the US was doing in Afghanistan, and obviously more importantly later in the lead up to the war on Iraq. So let me take this introduction and go right to it with a question first to Bruce Riedel. The question here is, you were at the White House when the horror happened, when Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11. And I wonder if you could give us a sense about what the real options were on the table as you saw them at that time. And I'm not really talking about sort of the emotional part of it, which we all understand and it's been talked about and we all felt, but more about analytically, as someone who was there, as someone who has been a great analyst of American policy and the Middle East over the years and of terrorism and counterterrorism. What were the real options on the table as you saw them, and how did they develop in the coming weeks?
Certainly, Shelly. First of all, thank you for inviting me to such a distinguished panel. Let me say a few words of background about the situation in the White House in September of 2001. All summer, particularly from the beginning of August on, we were inundated with intelligence reports that an al-Qaeda attack inside the United States, inside the homeland, was coming. Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, was literally going door to door in the administration, warning that an attack was imminent. Unfortunately, the Bush administration didn't do anything about it. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice never called a meeting of the principals or of the deputies to discuss the threat environment. I am convinced that had such a meeting been held, we probably would have thwarted the plot. It would have come to the surface that there were two al-Qaeda operatives known to be in the United States of America, and that would have led to tracking them down. So in addition to the shock, the horror, there was great concern in the White House that an investigation of what had happened would find that the administration had bungled the job very, very badly. So they wanted very much to go on offense and to take action. In addition, of course, the reporting we had suggested that 9/11 was just one of many attacks that al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were planning. We recently, in the last week or so, have gotten declassified information of a major al-Qaeda plot to attack Israel in March of 2002, which would have been devastating in the context of the Second Intifada. So the option on the table there really wasn't an option. The option was, we've got to break up al-Qaeda's infrastructure in Afghanistan and in Pakistan as quickly as possible. We went through the motion of asking the Taliban to turn them over. We went to the Pakistanis and asked them to put pressure on the Taliban to turn them over, and the Taliban refused. They outright insisted that he was a guest and that he was not a threat. They would not take any action against him. So the options nailed down to how are we going to go into Afghanistan. Fortunately, the CIA had already been planning such a mission for months and months. One of the reasons why George Tenet wanted a meeting was to get the authority to send his operatives into northern Afghanistan, work with the Northern Alliance, Ahmad Shah Massoud and others, in order to track down and get Osama bin Laden one way or another. And essentially, that CIA plan was what morphed into the invasion of Afghanistan. It was a tricky operation. As we've all come to learn, Afghanistan is on the far side of the world. It's a landlocked country. It's not that easy to get to. In the end, we were able to get there, but it was quite a challenge. Now, the option that was under the table, I would put it, which became glaringly obvious in time, was that we were not only going to go after Osama bin Laden, we were going to go after Saddam Hussein, even though there wasn't one shred of evidence that linked the Iraqis to the 9/11 attack. I recently found my diary for 2001, and it shows that on September 14th, I was in the Oval Office with the president when he talked to Tony Blair. And in the middle of the conversation with Tony Blair about 9/11, George Bush says, we're going to attack Iraq too. 3 days after 9/11, he tells the British he's going to attack Iraq. Now, Tony Blair was stunned. You could tell in the listening to the phone call that the British Prime Minister was just completely taken aback. Now, in time, of course, he would come around. But at the moment, he didn't see this as making any sense at all. But that option would, as you pointed out, ultimately become exercised. And by the spring of 2002, the White House was openly talking about going to war with Iraq.
Yeah, this is really great. In fact, I want to stick with this point and go to Ryan, because I think, Ryan, if I recall correctly, you were dispatched to be head of mission in Afghanistan really within weeks, early January 2002. And so a lot of the things that Bruce talked about in terms of the mission as it was defined and the complexity of that mission, given where Afghanistan was and how much presence we didn't have in that country. I wonder what things look like to you. And if I could add more to this transition about how it was seen from the outside, your thoughts on three connected issues that impacted the way the world saw it. In some ways, Bruce touched on them already. One, obviously, is the way ultimately we define the war on terrorism. You know, they hate us for our values. But the other is how the mission itself evolved in Afghanistan. People didn't know how it's going to go, and obviously it wasn't like some people expected. But the third, perhaps Bruce highlighted that early on, the Iraq war, that it was not easy to separate, because the mission, if you're already planning to go to an Iraq war, in a way, this is a stepping stone. What you do in Afghanistan isn't just an objective in itself, but it is setting the stage for something bigger. Was that obvious at the time?
I had just returned to Washington from Damascus. I was ambassador to Syria, 98 to 2001, and had taken up the duties of Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, covering Iraq and the Gulf area. So before I got to Afghanistan, my life had already changed, in the sense that when civil aviation reopened, I was on one of the first flights out of Dulles, heading for Europe, and on to Geneva to sit down with something called the Geneva Group. This was a group convened under UN auspices, the legendary Lakhdar Brahimi, in this case, at UN headquarters in Geneva. The participants were Italy, Germany, Iran, and the United States. This had been in existence for some years. It was a forum that allowed us to talk directly to the Iranians on matters pertaining to Afghanistan. I didn't even know it existed, because in the unique tribal structure of the State Department, Afghanistan was part of the South Asia Bureau, whereas I was part of the Near East tribe, and the boundary was the Iranian boundary to the east with Afghanistan and Pakistan. But after 9/11, we had something to talk to the Iranians about. They also saw the Taliban as an enemy, and indeed almost went to war with them in the late 1990s. So we had this interesting experience of actually having a common objective. And the Iranians that I talked to got very impatient with us. Are you guys gonna take out the Taliban, or aren't you? They provided their order of battle for Taliban forces, described how they would proceed if they were us, which is rather an extraordinary concept. And we talked about what Bruce just mentioned, the Northern Alliance and that area that had never fallen under Taliban control. They had their guys, of course, with the Northern Alliance right from the beginning, when the Taliban took over in 96 and maybe before. And indeed, my primary Iranian interlocutor was not a career diplomat. He was a career Revolutionary Guard officer and part of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani's outfit. And we got along pretty well. Both of us were sort of inclined to action. And at one point, with authorization from the agency, I put to him that, so you got your guys up with the Northern Alliance. We got our guys up with the Northern Alliance. And I'll bet you anything that the Northern Alliance is probably playing us off against each other. He agreed that was probable. So I said, how about, my guys talk to your guys on the ground? He found that intriguing, but in our next meeting came back to say that Haji Qasim found that maybe just a little premature. Let's see how things play out first. So when I did get to Afghanistan, Kabul, guess what? My negotiating counterpart was their ambassador to Afghanistan. And we continued the conversation in Kabul, again at UN headquarters, or the UN mission there, Lakhdar Brahimi once more, except Lakhdar Brahimi wasn't there. He just gave us the flag in the office. So we were having some fairly productive conversations. And then, of course, we had the State of the Union Address 2002, the Axis of Evil, in which Iran was so labeled. And that kind of ended that as a productive process. And kind of sad here, really. One of the issues we had under discussion was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a notorious Mujahideen leader, very anti-US. The Iranians had him under house arrest. So we were talking about how he might possibly be maybe handed over to the Afghan Interim Authority and then to us. And then we have State of the Union. My Iranian interlocutor called for an urgent meeting, and I just, rolled my eyes saying, Jesus, he's going to shred me. But what he did was kind of a final courtesy, really, if you will, to tell me that Hekmatyar had been deposited by Iran across the border in Afghan Baluchistan in a specific little town. We rolled on it immediately, and what he told me was true, but Hekmatyar had already gone. And we spent years trying to track him down. Eventually, he did come out of the cold. But, I wonder how many American service members lost their lives to Hekmatyar before he switched sides that wouldn't have had some bright boy in Washington not decided to slip Iran in there at the last minute. So many tangled stories here.
Yeah, well, this is fascinating. And I want to come back to it because obviously you had that mission early on, and then they came back to both Pakistan and Afghanistan in a big way. And I'd like to explore that a little bit. But I want to turn to Amaney more about the regional perspective, meaning sort of given what you study, obviously you also follow what happens in our own country and you analyze that as well. But in terms of the reaction, at least in the Arab world that you study so well and that you and I have done a lot of public opinion polling on, in terms of how would you kind of describe the evolution, if there is one, in the region, in the evolution of the reaction to 9/11 and the American response to 9/11? Maybe we could differentiate both, because I think 9/11 itself created tremendous amount of goodwill across the globe. But America's reaction to 9/11 generated a different kind of reaction. So it's not really 9/11, it's what America did in response. And that might be really a good way to describe what transpired also in the Middle East. So I'd like to hear you, particularly with regard to those three issues that I articulated, namely how the Bush administration defined the war on terrorism, particularly the tone it set by saying it's, they hate us for our values, sort of a message that was sent out, versus the scale of war in Afghanistan and civilian casualties versus the focus on Iraq, which was, as Bruce suggested, was from day one, but certainly publicly, it became much more focused in the weeks ahead. So I'd love to hear from you kind of a description of how you saw that evolution in the reaction in the Middle East particularly.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And again, it's an honor to be here with the distinguished panelist here. So initially, you know, on the eve of 9/11, when those towers came down, I think in the Middle East, as elsewhere across the globe, people were horrified. People were horrified that this happened on American soil. People were horrified that this happened in the name of Islam. It was unfortunate. If you even when you thought about the media coverage, while in most countries there were visuals in front of like U.S. embassies, U.S. missions to commemorate the loss of life, oftentimes what was sort of captured on Fox News were just like, you know, the few radical groups or, you know, hoodlums, if you may, who were celebrating the attacks. But by and large, the citizens across the region stood by the United States, stood by the tragedy of the United States, and they were there, you know, in visual with their candles in hand, commemorating the events. And I think just like both Bruce and Ryan pointed out, that in the initial days, as the US was preparing for an attack on Afghanistan to rid the region of terrorism, I think by and large you could say, although nobody in the region, in the MENA region supports war, there was this sort of silent conviction that terrorism is a problem, and if Arab and Middle Eastern governments can't take care of it, they would probably welcome somebody else to help them out on that front, right? You know, this is when Al-Qaeda, you know, people were nervous about Al-Qaeda across the board. And initially, also after 9/11, just so we sort of contextualize the events accurately, the Bush administration came out initially very, very specifically to sort of emphasize that this was not a clash of values, and this was not a clash of, let's say, Islam in the West. He visited the DC mosque in Washington, DC. He made a very, you know, very thoughtful speech. Several people in the Muslim community were actually taken aback by it in terms of just feeling in a very positive way. However, as the Bush administration began to plan its attack on Iraq, which had no rational goal. It was not necessarily linked to the war on terror. We began to see this escalation of a discourse that pitted the US against Islam, almost to say, well, the reason we have to go into Iraq, right, which was not linked to Afghanistan, which was not linked to Al-Qaeda, which was not linked to any of the other issues that the US was dealing with vis-a-vis the terrorist threat. Well, you know, Saddam Hussein ultimately is like many of these other leaders who has the potential and the propensity to support radicalized movements, because ultimately we have this civilizational divide between the Middle East and the United States. And that's where you begin to see this value clash. And then, you know, language like the axis of evil, language like the reason why we were attacked is because the people in that part of the world don't share our values here at home, right? So it's all of a sudden a value issue. Again, when you're saying that, you're basically saying that their values are so primordial, so backward and so uncivilized, it justifies intervention at the mass scale of what we saw then, not only in Afghanistan, but what we saw in Iraq. You know, the whole shock and awe type of sort of like, you know, invasion there. So it's no surprise that the public, you know, sort of was won over in terms of being green lighted, going for the U.S. to go into Iraq with this massive devastation, putting our U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq to take down an entire regime. You know, like if you take a political science course, political science 101, the minute you take down the security apparatus of any country, you are committing our troops on the ground to do state building work, when that's not our troops' jobs to be doing. So we get engaged. We found ourselves stuck in Iraq. We found ourselves putting our children on the ground, fighting a war that we could not win. We could not build a state. And then using the language of civilizational divide to justify that war, I think was just like, you know, shocking. The truth is, then we began to see the whole language about, well, the WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction. First, we were told they were in Baghdad, then they were outside of Baghdad, then they were north, and then they were east, and then they were west, and then we couldn't find them. And then we had to then rely even more on the civilizational divide and the language of civilizational inferiority, if you may, to justify why we stayed in Iraq, because we had to now. We really had no strategy. So then linking all of that back to the region and sort of like public opinion, where we are monitoring it in the Arab Barometer, the Arab Barometer begins to pick up a lot of these opinions around 2006, 2007. So this is post-US invasion, but the US is still deeply embedded in Iraq at the time. And what you see there is that the war on Iraq really did not serve, if there was a US geostrategic sort of strategy, which, you know, and I sort of believe when you're dealing with this sort of war on terror, the fight on terrorism, you're ultimately dealing with a war on minds, hearts and minds. It's a war that requires some soft power, right? And the idea behind that is you want to make sure the language and the discourse of terrorists only reaches a minimal audience, and that the majority of the population out there are basically swayed against that terrorist doctrine, so that they are not going to turn against their own people, their own governments, or let's say external actors. So in that sense, the US is also very responsible in terms of promoting a discourse that ensures that you keep these terrorist groups contained, and they cannot sort of disseminate and reach out of the, you know, different territories to reach broader audiences. The war on Iraq did not help. The war on Iraq, with the devastation, the hundreds of, you know, upwards of 200,000 in the way of civilian casualties. You get Abu Ghraib that comes out of Iraq. Again, this dehumanization and dehumanization of Iraqi prisoners. All of this contributes to this anti-American discourse that the US is an imperial force. The US is capable of dehumanizing the citizens of the region, and it has ulterior motives. The discourse plays out, of course, is that this was a war to secure the oil fields of Iraq, not necessarily US geostrategic interest. It basically put US troops in harm's way. So it really did put back these efforts of winning hearts and minds. And I think people are still contending with this right now.
When, you know, it's interesting, of course, you're analyzing the consequences of the Iraq war, which many of us saw and obviously opposed it. Some of us scholars took an ad in the New York Times saying it's not in America's national interest. But to be fair to people in the government like Ryan Crocker and Bill Burns and Bruce Riedel, they saw it too.
Yeah.
And in fact, Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post in her book revealed that, you know, Powell had asked Ryan Crocker and Bill Burns to prepare a report about the consequences of what would come out. And they, of course, spelled it out. All of the things that we know about the sectarianism, the destabilization, the intervention from outside players, from Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others. So it isn't that it was hard to foresee, it is that those who were making the decisions didn't want to hear that message. And that takes me back to Bruce again. At that moment, could it have been different? Were there options that could have been pursued that could have taken America in a different course after 9/11? And I say that because at one level, it's obvious. The rallying behind the flag that took place was unprecedented in my memory. You have a super empowered president in ways that I had never witnessed, a man who was elected by less than 50% of the American people. And the next morning after 9/11, his approval rating goes up to 90% because people obviously want to rally behind the flag and say, take us where you want to take us, we'll go with you. He certainly had an opportunity, President Bush had an opportunity to take us in different places. And he chose to take us in this path. And if Bruce is right, and I have every reason to believe he is, that he from day one wanted to take us to Iraq, I wonder whether there was another set of options that was even presented by people like you, Bruce. And I say that because you also mentioned about the fact that Al-Qaeda was driven, unlike the conventional wisdom, not by the value conflict, not even by so much by the presence of American forces in the region, but motivated at the core by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is something that was denied early on. You wrote a piece in the Brookings website 2 days ago, based on some of the new declassified information, saying Al-Qaeda was always motivated by Israel-Palestine, and it still is. Its leadership is motivated principally by that. But there was a fear that that might translate into an anti-Israel backlash in America. And I want to take within weeks, in early October of 2001, a man who had been supported by President Bush, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, issued a warning saying he was fearing that there will be another Munich, that the US will sell Israel out to after 9/11. So there was a certain sense maybe that this could have taken a different course than the one it took, that the administration may have been able to focus on Israel-Palestine if it wanted to. The public was behind the president. The international community would have wholeheartedly supported, certainly governments in the Middle East. He could have even ended, if he wanted to, the sanctions on Iraq, and the public would have supported him. So I wonder if there was any time when you were there in the early days, when there was anything presented other than this course that ultimately took us to Iraq.
It's a very good question. Let me divide it into two categories. There was the immediate, overwhelming need to respond to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan before another attack came. There was no argument in the administration that we shouldn't do that. There was consensus that we should. Colin Powell, Rumsfeld, Cheney, all of them agreed this is the immediate response. But there was debate over the bigger question. You put your finger on it exactly, Shu. You don't have to be, you don't have to read every statement of Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri to realize that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the motivating factor behind it. There's a famous quote, which I suspect is not really true, in which Osama bin Laden was asked, did he attack the United States because of our values? And he responds back, if I didn't like the way you dressed women, I would have attacked Sweden, not the United States. Point was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Secretary Powell did make a very strong case that we had to address this issue. You'd earlier mentioned the speech that he was to give. That speech in the end morphed into many things, but one of them was in George Bush's address to the UN General Assembly in either October or November. For the first time, an American president endorsed the two-state solution and called for the creation of the state of Palestine. Now, some will argue, yes, but we've been talking about that in the Clinton administration for the previous 8 years. But the president had never called for the creation of a Palestinian state in a public statement. This was a significant new ground. But that's as far as the Bush administration wanted to take it. For a variety of reasons, including the fact that the Clinton administration failed so grievously at Camp David, there was no appetite for real negotiations with the Israelis and Palestinians. There was only an appetite for trying to get a ceasefire in the Second Intifada, and that all fell apart by March of 2002 with the apprehension of the arms shipment going from Iran to the Palestinians. And that was an option. It could have been explored. You know, you could have taken advantage of 9/11 to use that to end the Second Intifada, pivot to an ending, say, okay, we've seen that this got out of control. 3,000 Americans are dead. It's now time to call upon you, Yasser Arafat, you, Ariel Sharon, to end the violence, separate the party. But that was not what the Bush administration wanted to do, and we've all said it was very clear very quickly that the people who counted in the Bush administration, the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of Defense, were not satisfied with going to Afghanistan. They were intent on going to war with Iraq, one way or another. I should also say, there never was serious evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Last 2 years of the Clinton administration, we frantically looked for any hint of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in order to justify the continued sanctions. Thankfully, Saddam Hussein threw the inspectors out, which gave us the justification to keep the sanctions in place. If he hadn't done that and forced us to produce evidence of weapons of mass destruction, there was none. And that was a known fact in the United States government in 2002. There was no, there's the famous line of George Tenet, it's a slam dunk. One has to look at the context of that conversation. The president has brought George Tenet and his deputy into the Oval Office in order to lay out the case. They lay out the case for weapons of mass destruction, and the president said, that's it? That's all you've got? There's no better evidence than that? And that's when George made the unfortunate comment, it's a slam dunk. The point was the president heard the evidence and he knew there was no weapons of mass destruction. It remains one of the mysteries of my life. Why was the president of the United States so obsessed with Saddam Hussein in 2001 and 2002 that he wanted to go to war? What was the root cause of that obsession? I don't think we have a good answer 20 years later.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that has always been my puzzling question about what is driving the president on this issue. I want to go back to Ryan, really about connecting Iraq and Afghanistan. Ryan, I mean, I think one of the issues when you went in early on in early January, obviously you had to define a very immediate practical mission that you had to deal with at a time when the infrastructure was limited. But later on, you became an ambassador to Iraq, you came back to Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I'm just wondering whether you thought that the Iraq and Afghanistan issues were directly connected, by which I mean that early drive toward the Iraq war that Bruce described, that the president had, and obviously everybody else was pushing for within the administration. Those who, like you, who had reservations were pushed aside, including the most popular man, Colin Powell. So was there a direct connection in the sense that that decision really affected what we were doing in Afghanistan? And later on, the Iraq war and the entanglement of Iraq and the focus in Iraq that undermined the mission and redefine it in the Afghanistan conflict? How would you answer that?
Well, before I got to Afghanistan, I got to Iraq. The beginning of December, I was asked to fly out to Turkey and then go by road down into the Kurdish areas in northern Iraq. The message I was to convey to the Kurdish leaders, Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani, was that no decisions had been made in Washington about a possible military intervention in Iraq. What we needed the Kurds to do was to do nothing. Do not speculate, do not assume, and above all, don't try to preempt. In other words, do not send your Peshmerga south to precipitate a war, expecting that we will then launch one. These are very experienced individuals. They knew exactly what I was saying. Do what we tell you when we tell you to do it. Don't mess this up, and it will be to your advantage. So in my mind, and then of course, by the end of December, I was on my way to Afghanistan. So December 01 was pretty eventful for me, but it also established in my mind a connection here. And indeed, while I was in Kabul, I remember one long evening with the president, our chairman, Karzai at that time, and a couple of his key advisors. We were going through lists of names, trying to identify hyphenated Afghans in the United States and really throughout the developed world who might be recruited to return to their country of origin and bringing their skills with them to, things like road building and electrical generation and healthcare and just about everything, because there was nothing left by the time the Taliban were ousted by us. I mean, it was just a complete zone of devastation. And I took that lesson back to me, actually, to Washington. And when I got back in April, thinking, well, nobody's asked me what I think of this, but it does look like there is a reasonable probability we are going to go to war in Iraq. And if we do, maybe we could do some of the homework first. Certainly wished we'd had, there had been some effort to identify those Afghans before the fact. And that led to something called the Future of Iraq Project, in which we sought out the best and the brightest who were from Iraq originally, who still had connections there, who cared about it, and put together a project in which a number of papers were written on, again, what might be necessary to do in Iraq if Saddam was removed from power by us. It wasn't the papers we were aiming at, it was building that Rolodex. So that unlike Afghanistan, if we did go into Iraq, we would have a list of people that we could call on for some of that now infamous nation building. So again, the connections were there. I certainly saw them. And even before I got to Afghanistan, I was hearing some of the same things that Bruce had described, that there were folks over at DOD who were saying, well, this is actually going to slow us down on Iraq. We got to deal with Afghanistan now, so we're going to have to push Iraq off to the side for at least a little while. So there was that sense of inevitability throughout this process. But I would have to say, Shively, we are, of course, a democracy, certainly flawed. All democracies are. November 2002, the congressional elections. And by and large, the American people voted to have a big old war in Iraq. We had Bush's UN speech, but that election, to me, that sealed the deal. We were going to go. 4 years later, when I was in Pakistan, the 2006 congressional elections, the American people voted not to have a big old war in Iraq. But guess what? You can't rewind the film. We talk about the American people as the bedrock of our democracy, and that is absolutely true. But with that goes a certain responsibility that the American people should not try to duck or avoid. We got the war we wanted in 2002, and then unfortunately could not undo it when they decided otherwise in 2006.
Yeah, this is interesting, and I want to come back actually to this connection because I want to bring it up to the moment. Sort of have the last 15 minutes discussing now. But I have one more question about then to Amaney, and it's really about this public opinion that you talked about. we do know that Arab governments typically deal with the US. They have to, it's a superpower. They're dependent on it, many of them in the Gulf and elsewhere. And even those who didn't like the Iraq war and advice against it, ultimately when the US made a decision, they went along and they had every interest to pretend that it was the right thing to do. But the public, of course, that was not where they were from the beginning. You and I have done a lot of public opinion polls that showed public opposition across the board in all the countries where we have done public opinion polls. The issue is that, was that also amplified during that period, beginning with 2001 through the Iraq war, by the fact that we have had an information revolution in the Middle East? In the late 90s, we had the rise of satellite television, particularly Al Jazeera, that amplifies the message, that makes public opinion more animated, that impacts the war of ideas and creates more space for opposition. I wonder how you saw that evolving during that period, and how much of a factor you thought that was in the projection of this anti-Americanism that was taking place.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shibli, for that question. So definitely as the Arab media and Arab media outlets have become more sophisticated, and this period sort of coincides with the advent of satellite television in the region. You get your Al Jazeera and your Al Arabiya, and then you get sort of the response with Al Hurra. You get this war of media satellite channels to sort of win hearts and minds in the region. And, you know, I think these satellite stations definitely did contribute, not necessarily only to some, increasing levels of anti-Americanism, because that sort of then reinforces this idea that Al Jazeera has only been anti-American and Al Arabiya is sort of in the middle, and then Al Hurra has come on the scene to try to sort of win hearts and minds in a pro-American fashion. And it sort of leaves us with the idea that if we can just get the PR right, without policy change, we can get the hearts and minds formula in place. And the truth is, remember, even as the media is sort of circulating around, you have this devastating war in Iraq, and it's becoming clearer and clearer to the populations in the region that the US is going to be there for quite a while. And every day, I mean, as all of, all my colleagues know who are with us, the numbers games, the number of deaths and casualties coming out of Iraq was devastating to the region and to our morale here in the US. Again, and you sort of see this, what's also going on at the time is that, in my opinion, as the situation in Iraq gets worse for the United States, you sort of see this rise in Islamophobia happening. So you get 9/11, you get, calls for quiet and peace, but then year in and year out, levels of Islamophobia, the rhetoric, the anti-Islamic rhetoric in the United States is also rising. So this is also being broadcast back to the Middle East via satellite, right? All of what's going on in the US. So it's sort of now, it's sort of really sort of playing out. If you're watching this now, looking back 20 years, you're thinking, oh my God, this is playing out like a clash of civilizations. When nobody ever thought this was going to be a clash of civilizations, it's playing out in the U.S. as such. It's now playing out in the Middle East, and we're forgetting that there's this horrible ongoing war. And bringing Bruce's point back to this, not only there's an ongoing war in Iraq, but on the Arab-Israeli side of the equation, the situation, or at least the hope for Palestinians, is diminishing. Oslo's failing, the Clinton effort failed, and now you're seeing sort of like this entrenchment of occupation on the West Bank. So the future of the Palestinian state is becoming more and more elusive. So all of this is happening, but the way it's playing out on the theater, the international theater, if you may, is we're involved in this civilizational war. Yeah. And that makes it far more difficult to sort of address, because now you're sort of like out there, like, all of us are out there trying to sort of like talk about why it's not necessarily civilizational per se. Thank you on that.
So, yeah, no, and I think, I've always believed that the Clash of Civilizations thesis had a self-fulfilling prophecy built into it. And because we are what we have to defend. And I've shown that in some of the polling that I've done, where if people in the Arab world feel that you are really, your policy is anti-Muslim, that you focus on them because they're Muslim, they become more Muslim. That identity rises to the top and clearly intensifies the conflict with the US. So we've witnessed this in a very graphic way, because we've had a lot of data from the Arab Barometer, from my project, from other projects that really have mapped this out. I want to turn now to the last 15 minutes to more the current moment. Let me start with Bruce. Bruce, I want to connect it in a way to the link between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the reason I want to do that is I recall when you helped produce the white paper for Obama back in 2009, it was really a white paper about Afghanistan and Pakistan. You always saw that those two are deeply linked, that addressing one means addressing the other, that you can't separate them so much. And in recent months, you were critical of the way the Trump administration was handling its negotiation with the Taliban, and later critical of the Biden administration, what you thought was ignoring Pakistan in its pursuit of an end of conflict in Afghanistan. So I wonder if you could elaborate more about that link and tell us where we are now on that issue, given that the US has pulled out.
Certainly. The Taliban, from their origin, were intimately connected to the Pakistani military and to the Pakistani intelligence service. The Musharraf regime realized pretty quickly after September 11th that they were in trouble and that they needed to do something dramatically different. And in effect, Pakistan in the late fall of 2001 did exactly what the Biden administration did this summer to the government of Afghanistan. In both cases, the supportive outside power pulled out the enablers that made the Afghan Taliban army in 2001 and the national government in 2021 work. And without those enablers on the ground, it was relatively easy to drive them out of the country in a hurry. Now, Pakistan switched policies quickly after that and resumed its intimate relationship with the Afghan Taliban, which it maintains to today. The United States, I think, has neglected Pakistan badly in the last 7 months. The president has yet to call Prime Minister Imran Khan on the phone. This is the 6th largest country in the world in terms of population. Whether or not you wanted to talk about Afghanistan, Pakistan in its own right merits discussion. And here's what I would say for the future. For the last 40 years, our policy towards Pakistan has been revolved heavily around our Afghan policy, either to defeat the Soviets or to defeat the Al-Qaeda. We needed Pakistan in a certain way. Our thinking about Pakistan was heavily influenced by Afghanistan. I would argue one virtue of where we are in the last few weeks is we're freed of that. We can now deal with Pakistan on its own as an entity that requires its own very unique American approach. We can engage Pakistan without constantly worrying about our supply line through Karachi. In that sense, we've been freed of that. And we should take advantage of that. I should say also, engagement doesn't mean agreement. We engage with the Russians, we engage with the Chinese. Does mean an active and significant dialogue. We should have Imran Khan come to the United States. We should invite him to a meeting in the Oval Office to talk to Congress. as Ryan knows better than I, he's a bit of a quirky individual, and that will come through. But all the better. We should know the man whose finger is on the trigger of one of the largest nuclear weapons arsenals in the world. Whether his finger really is on the trigger is another question. But he is the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and we need to deal with
it. Yeah. I want to ask Ryan a question related to the moment. I know that despite your reservations about the U.S. getting involved in war, period, and obviously Iraq particularly, you had very clear reservations that you expressed in the New York Times about the way the Biden administration pulled out of Afghanistan. So I wonder if you could tell us more about that, but also tie something into it now that the U.S. is out, and that's we now have a new reality on the ground. Whether or not the sort of stuff you talked about early on after 9/11, where the U.S. was coordinating with Iran, or the Iranians wanted to coordinate with the U.S. about a strategy toward the Taliban, whether now that could be revived. This is actually a question from my colleague, Dana Priest, whether or not there is a new opportunity or even need for that to happen.
Well, that's a waterfront covering question. Yes, I think that we have had both a strategic failure and a tactical failure. The strategic failure being the decision taken not by President Biden, but by President Trump to engage in direct negotiations with the Taliban without the government of Afghanistan present. That was a long-standing Taliban demand. We caved into it, and I said at the time that fact means these are not peace negotiations at all. These are surrender talks. We're done, and we're going to get out any way we can, and that's pretty much how it rolled out. So we delegitimized the government of Afghanistan and demoralized basically the entire country, and certainly its armed forces. That was compounded when President Trump basically compelled the Ashraf Ghani government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners who immediately rejoined the fight. So I'm just devastated to hear from the President of the United States, as well as others, that, we can't be fighting for Afghanistan when its own forces won't fight for it. Well, those forces were totally demoralized by our decision to abandon the country. They died by the thousands for years in this campaign, yet they stayed in the field. So this could not have been more calamitous than if we had tried to turn it into a calamity. And then, of course, President Biden comes to office. I think there was a disagreement, actually, in the administration very early on. Jake Sullivan, as National Security Advisor, on day 2 of the administration, called his counterpart, Ambassador Mohib, who had been on the government, the Trump administration's do not call list. And then after the call, the NSC issued a statement basically saying that the National Security Advisor had told his counterpart that we have serious issues in front of us, both of us, and that he looked forward to dealing with these issues with Afghanistan as a key and tested ally. A week later, of course, the Secretary of State sent a letter to President Ghani saying something very, very different. It was an extremely harsh letter in tone, and the main message was the zero option is most definitely on our table. Well, that was a calculated insult. Secretaries of State do not send correspondence to chiefs of state. And it furthered, again, that delegitimization of the government. It made it President Biden's policy now, as did his embrace of President Trump's envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad. So it should not, maybe the pace of collapse was a surprise, but the collapse, not at all. We had made it painfully clear we were done. The Taliban was coming back, not our problem, and we now have what we have. And I worry greatly about the long-term consequences of this. I think we're completely right on Pakistan. However, I fear that what we have done now is going to increase the challenges to Pakistan's own stability. We have emboldened Islamic militants around the world. We've given the Taliban the narrative that they, clad only in the one true faith, have defeated the infidels. Well, the Pakistani Taliban has certainly heard that one. I think, and they aim, of course, at overthrowing the government in Islamabad, not in Kabul. So the Pakistanis are in, I think, for some real trouble. And once again, I mean, it's 6, 7, 8 as the sixth most populous nation, 220 million roughly, the seventh largest standing army, and the 8th nuclear weapon nation. So we had better figure out a new Pakistan policy and figure it out pretty quickly, because that is one of the danger zones that I think they will be heading into as a consequence of our decision. On Iran, you know, I don't think we can have that conversation. The Iranians did support the Taliban just to get at us, but it's an uh-oh moment for them too. Again, their history with the Taliban, not so great. I think we need to keep an eye on that down the road a bit. There may be some necessities, if not opportunities, but right now I think we've got to focus more particularly on Pakistan.
Great. I want to give the last word to Amaney, but I want to say on this issue of withdrawal, obviously most people were troubled by the way the withdrawal took place. I happen to actually think that the withdrawal decision ultimately is a good one. There's a lot of people that agree and disagree on this. We all will. Nonetheless, I was not surprised by the collapse of the army. And partly because the assessment was without the US, they had no chance to win. And if I were in their place, I would have quit rather than fight and ultimately lose thousands or more people. I don't think that was surprising to me. I wrote about that early on, but it's a painful time. Now we need to think ahead about what we could do better. Let me give Amaney the last word, but I just want you to think about it, Amaney, in the context of the reality. So the US has pulled out of Afghanistan. We're on the way out of maybe completely from Iraq. Those are two huge issues that have undermined America's standing. The Israeli-Palestinian issue still remains. That was already the major grievance prior to 9/11. How do you see attitudes shifting, if at all, in the Arab world?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to be brief, just to be, you know, I'm mindful of the time. But you know, what's striking about the Afghanistan issue, in terms of everything that Bruce and Ryan highlighted, what we have to be worried about are the second-order consequences that will affect different segments of the population across the region who have been working with the United States, whether it's through USAID campaigns, whether it's through civil society and NGOs, whether it's through the women's empowerment, right? A lot of the women empowerment NGOs are linked to Europe and the United States. And this idea that the US can abandon support just like that and walk away is going to make people think twice about partnerships with the United States. That's where I'm worried. That's where we in the Arab Barometer are going to be monitoring. And so this is something that we need to keep our eyes on as we move forward. Again, you know, I think part of this is that, you know, the US, you know, it would be nice if we have to be sort of consistent in terms of our goals and what we want to accomplish in our intervention and our diplomacy with the Middle East. And if we want to accomplish anything above and beyond the stability and the status quo of our alliances, then we sort of have to sort of be thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So, you know, in many ways, I think this was a blow to the youth. in the region who are looking to the United States, who are looking to external actors in terms of that hope of a better future. And I'll end it on that point.
Well, thanks so much. And by the way, we're about to release a poll with Mark Lynch on the Middle East Scholar Barometer. And you will find that a majority of the Middle East scholars agree with Ryan and you that the way the withdrawal was handled undermines America's credibility in the Middle East. So there is a majority of scholars actually agree on that. It's divided close, but the majority do. We'll release that next week. I'm so grateful to all three of you for joining us. This has been an exceptional conversation. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Amaney. I am so pleased with having some of your time for this busy period. This has been, of course, a horrific event that we're commemorating tomorrow. It's one that has changed us. And I recall that within a few days, I wrote a piece in the New York Times just a week later saying, you cannot defend your values by subverting them. And I think that that's the path that we took, unfortunately, in the past 2 decades. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you again.